China has identified the cause of the
mysterious new virus. Coronavirus.
There are fears a rapidly spreading virus has reached Australia.
This is a rapidly emerging situation.
Where there are cases, the government can quickly implement targeted measures and focus control efforts where they're needed most.
Together in collaboration with the pharmaceutical companies,
we need vaccines to immunize ourselves.
And then the final solution, which is a year to 2 years off, is the vaccine.
The answer to that is to really close things down.
Hello again, and welcome back to The Abstract. I am your host, Peter Kirby, author of the book Chemtrails Exposed, a New Manhattan Project. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Tainan Airport and the New Manhattan Project. I speculate that Tainan Airport in southwestern Taiwan is the global home of the dedicated chemtrail fleet. I did a piece about the dedicated chemtrail fleet last year. If you want to check that out, please do. It's called The Dedicated Few. It's in my Rumble stack on The Abstract. But we're going to be looking at this home of the dedicated chemtrail fleet. This airport, Tainan Airport, has been the home of the Central Intelligence Agency's proprietary airlines, and there's a long history of that going back to the Flying Tigers. But this Tainan Airport was home to Air Asia, which was a CIA proprietary. It was also home to Civil Air Transport, which was another CIA proprietary airline, as well as Air America, and I believe some other permutations of Air America. There's other airlines within other airlines that are subsets of Air America, but it was the CIA was running their proprietary aircrafts out of Tainan Airport historically. But the most compelling evidence that I've seen pertaining to Tainan Airport in Taiwan is that there were these world-class maintenance facilities there, and I believe they're still there today at Tainan Airport. These maintenance facilities were the home of a CIA proprietary airline called Air Asia. And in 1974, they held the Church Committee hearings, and as a result of that, in 1975, these world-class maintenance facilities at Tainan Airport were sold, and they no longer became the home of Air Asia, but they were bought by this CIA cutout called E-Systems. So E-Systems had these huge world-class airplane maintenance facilities at Tainan Airport, and E-Systems was the first builder of the HARP antenna, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Project up there in Alaska. Now, if you're familiar with my work, this is what's known as an ionospheric heater. It's commonly known as HARP. And there are about 12 patents pertaining to HARP, and 2 or 3 of those talk about how HARP can control the weather. It's a little bit too much to go into right now. We're going to stick with Tainan Airport. But it's extremely interesting that there was a certain company called E-Systems, a CIA cutout, that acquired these world-class maintenance facilities at Tainan Airport and was the first builder of HARP. That's 2 major elements of what I call the New Manhattan Project, this second-generation global weather modification project involving dispersed particulates that come out the back of airplanes and then hitting the dispersed particulates with electromagnetic energy from antennas such as HARP. There are other antennas that look to be involved in this thing, more localized things, but these ionospheric heaters are the big, heavy-duty machinery that has huge power to control the weather. The HARP antenna is powered by the natural gas that comes from the North Slope of Alaska, which is just a huge facility where they, if you know about mining for oil, drilling for oil, when you get the oil out of the ground, a whole bunch of natural gas comes out of the ground with it. And they take that natural gas and pipe it over to HARP, and they need, that huge amount of energy to power this thing. But anyway, we're back to Tainan Airport. Taiwan, where Tainan Airport is located, has long been a staging ground for the CIA. The CIA had huge operations running out of Taiwan pretty much ever since the Japanese surrendered in 1945, but they really stepped things up after the nationalist Chinese came over in 1949, and we're going to go over that. Now, if you'll notice, the Central Intelligence Agency keeps on coming up here, and they keep on coming up in all things associated with the New Manhattan Project. They play an extremely prominent role in my book. And I do believe that they are, or at least have been, the day-to-day managers of the entire project. And as far as my book is concerned, as I mentioned in the last video, it is completely done. It's been handed off to Skyhorse, and it's in their court now, and they're working on it and putting the finishing touches on it, doing some copy editing and conforming the citations and creating an index and things. January 20th of next year is the release date for the revised and updated Skyhorse edition of Chemtrails Exposed, a New Manhattan Project. Pre-order your copy now. And so, this dedicated chemtrail fleet that I've covered already, it's covered in my book extensively, and as I say, I did a video about it last year. This is a necessary component of what I call the New Manhattan Project, because there are commercial airlines involved. All commercial airlines, I believe, have been outfitted with spraying equipment that play a supporting role in spraying us. They add to the atmospheric saturations as they fly their predetermined routes and whatnot. But I do believe that you need a dedicated chemtrail fleet, because it's much more versatile and much more effective to have dedicated planes that can go anywhere at a moment's notice, anywhere that they're needed, in order to disperse the chemtrail spray, what is actually coal fly ash. Also, they have a whole lot of it on board. They probably have the capability to disperse more of it at any location where they are. And, when you have a plane that's filled up with passengers and luggage and freight and whatnot, it's just not as effective. You need a whole bunch of other stuff in there. With a dedicated plane, you can be much more effective if it's loaded up with electronics, atmospheric monitoring equipment, loads of chemtrail spray, and other high-tech equipment that you're just not going to be able to put into passenger and freight commercial aircraft. So I do believe that you need a dedicated chemtrail fleet. The evidence shows that there is a dedicated chemtrail fleet. It's covered in my book, covered in the video I did last year. But I have not really spoken about this, or I haven't, it's not in my book too much. I mentioned Tainan Airport in my book, but I mentioned it in the context of it may have been a place where the chemtrail planes were developed or produced. But I don't talk about Tainan Airport in my book as the place that might be the global hub of operations for this dedicated chemtrail fleet. And so this is really the first time that I've gone into this assertion about how Tainan Airport is the global hub of the dedicated chemtrail fleet. I do believe that this type of global hub is necessary for the dedicated chemtrail fleet. I used to drive a cab, and I know that every time that you needed something, you needed to have that place that you could always go back to get what you need. In the context of driving a cab, it is the garage, the cab garage. You go there, they have a restroom you can use. If you need change for a $100 bill, they have that. They've had lockers in there where you can store your stuff. They have mechanics. They have the guy that can pump the gas. They have, people that can do little things to fix the car for you and whatnot. You might want to talk to management there. And I do believe that the same applies to any fleet of vehicles or any dedicated fleet of vehicles. I understand there's Uber out there and, they've decentralized and things. But I think, when you're talking about this specialized fleet of vehicles, in this case aircraft, you're going to need a certain place somewhere in the world, because this is a global operation, somewhere in the world where they can always go to get what they need. And although there are probably many other satellite locations around America and around the world where chemtrail spraying planes can get things that they need, such as more chemtrail spray, those locations are not always going to have the equipment or the infrastructure that these dedicated planes need. These are simple facts of logistics. And in order to keep this operation constantly up and running, as it has been for about 30 years, there needs to be a central place where these dedicated chemtrail planes can go, and the evidence indicates that Tainan Airport is that location. I think it's important that we look at the political leadership of Taiwan, who's been running Taiwan, who's been in charge while this dedicated chemtrail fleet has been built and made a home, according to the evidence, in Tainan Airport. Now, Taiwan was established, or it was formed basically in 1949 when this political party known as the Kuomintang, we're going to refer to it as the KMT because I may be mispronouncing that, but it's called the Kuomintang as far as I know. This was the political party, the group that was under Chiang Kai-shek during World War II. It actually started before World War II, but as far as America is concerned, and the story is concerned, we're concerning ourselves with the Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek beginning in World War II. And it was decided at the Cairo Conference of 1943, as it appeared that the Axis powers were going to lose. There was a conference held in Cairo in 1943 where President Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek met, and it was decided there that should the nationalist Chinese win and the Japanese be defeated, the Japanese were making incursions upon mainland China during World War II, and they occupied the island of what was known as Formosa, then modern-day Taiwan. And it was decided at this Cairo conference that the nationalist Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek would take Formosa after Japan lost the war. And of course, in 1945, we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered, and the nationalist Chinese were granted the island of Formosa, as in accordance with the Cairo Conference of 1943. But after World War II ended, the nationalist Chinese had to battle the communist Chinese. They had been battling the communist Chinese off and on during World War II, and I believe before World War II as well. It was kind of a love-hate relationship early on, and it just turned into pure hate, during World War II and afterwards. But in the period following the Japanese surrender, it was a fight between the nationalist Chinese and the communist Chinese, and the communist Chinese won. This is what is ruling China today, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and they ousted the nationalist Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek to the island of Formosa in 1949. So it's been the nationalist Chinese, also known as the Kuomintang, that have been in charge of Taiwan ever since 1949. Chiang Kai-shek was initially in charge during the move to Taiwan, and he was in power for some time after that, but at some point he passed it on to his son, and the Kuomintang actually had kind of a decline in decades following that, but they're still around to this day. As far as I can tell, they're an extremely powerful, if not the most powerful, political group in Taiwan today. But the most important part of all this pertaining to our story is, who are these people? What is this group that's been in charge of this country that has apparently overseen the construction of this dedicated chemtrail fleet and their home at Tainan Airport? It is interesting to note that modern Taiwan was established as a vassal state of America. They wouldn't be able to exist without American aid, and they have a long history of CIA involvement. The Kuomintang, the nationalist Chinese, without the probably tens of billions of dollars in American financial and military aid. If you sum it all up, it's kind of hard to add it all up because, it comes in this loan here and, this grant here and then this military aid here. But I think the ballpark estimate, we're looking at easily over $10 billion in help for establishing the Kuomintang, the nationalist Chinese, and forming modern-day Taiwan. It's all been due to American involvement. Without that, the Kuomintang would have been destroyed by the Communist Chinese, undoubtedly. And this is all pertinent to our story because what I call the New Manhattan Project has been developed in America. So the country that developed the New Manhattan Project also brought up the Kuomintang in Taiwan. Now, there was a huge effort at the time, in the 1950s particularly, where the mainstream media, led by Henry Luce of Time Incorporated, his other most famous publication was Fortune magazine, they basically put a smiley face on this tyranny. They were part of something called the China Lobby. And this was a whole expansive group of people involving all kinds of money and power, and it just went on for decades, talking about how we need to support the nationalist Chinese because, we don't want the communists to take over. But in actuality, Shanghai Shek and the Kuomintang were no better than the communist Chinese. I mean, we know that the communist Chinese were horrible, right? They're legendary. Mao Zedong is known as one of the greatest mass murderers of all time. But really, Shanghai Shek was no better. This is pertinent to our story because I think that Shanghai Shek and the Kuomintang would have had no problem with, no moral qualms about building dedicated chemtrail planes that are designed to spray the earth and all of its biota with megatons of toxic waste annually. Tens of thousands of megatons of toxic waste annually. I think they would have had no problem with it. Let's look at Shanghai Shek. Personally, he was a literal gangster. He came up as a gangster with his green gang that ran illicit opium and the heroin trade in Shanghai. That's how he made his bones when he was young. He was a gangster who murdered his way to the top. Shang had a police record in Hong Kong that included murder, extortion, numerous armed robberies, and other crimes. I'm actually reading from my paper now because I liked this little couple of sentences that I put together here. Here's the second sentence. Shanghai Shek was known as a heavy drinking, whoring, mentally unstable bank robber and hitman who pathologically alternated between outbursts of hysterics and bouts of self-condemnation. His Green Gang operated like the Nazi brown shirts during World War II, going around and roughing up the domestic opposition. During World War II, in order to thwart the advancing Japanese, Shang blew up dikes, ancient dikes on the Yellow River. Several thousand villages were destroyed. A few million people became homeless because of it. 800,000 people died, and Shang lied about it. When Shanghai Shek and the Kuomintang came to Taiwan, they murdered about 30,000 people in order to secure their position there. After Shanghai Shek and the Kuomintang came to Taiwan, Martial law was in effect for almost 50 years. Henry Luce thought this was all wonderful and good, apparently. And America also supported the KMT's operations in Burma. You see, during their battles with the communists, there was I think it was about 10,000 troops retreated across the China-Burma border into Burma. And they established themselves in what's known as the Golden Triangle. And if you're familiar with these things, the Golden Triangle produces the best opium in the world, and a lot of it. And of course, historically, the Kuomintang and all groups that have been in power in China for a long time, going back centuries, basically relied primarily upon the opium trade to prop up their administrations. This is how it was done, and Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang were no exception. But it was this certain faction, this certain group of soldiers, Chinese soldiers, nationalist Chinese, that went across the border into Burma and continued producing opium and controlling the opium trade in their portion of the Golden Triangle, and they went on to greatly proliferate there. America, specifically the CIA, supported these operations. And it was part of the way that the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek established themselves in Taiwan. They were funded by, supported militarily by the Americans, as well as funded by the Americans. And then they also supported themselves by this KMT in Burma. I like this one passage from the book The Politics of Heroin by Alfred McCoy. McCoy writes, quote, "With CIA support, the KMT remained in Burma until 1961, when a Burmese army offensive drove them into Laos and Thailand. By this time, however, the Kuomintang had already used their control over the tribal populations to expand Shan State opium production by almost 500%. From less than 80 tons after World War II to an estimated 300 to 400 tons by 1962. From bases in northern Thailand, the KMT continued to send mule caravans into the Shan states to bring out the opium harvest. In 1973, 20 years after the CIA first began supporting KMT troops in the Golden Triangle, these KMT caravans controlled almost 1/3 of the world's total illicit opium supply and enjoyed a growing share of Southeast Asia's thriving heroin business, unquote. So, as the Central Intelligence Agency was greatly proliferating in Taiwan during all of this, what we had, most pertinent to our story, is an early example of a guns for drugs operation. These types of operations were, of course, made famous later in the 1980s with the CIA's operations in Central and South America. But this was an early example of the CIA flying personnel and materiel into the Golden Triangle from Taiwan, from Tainan Airport, and then flying opium out of the Golden Triangle into, guess what? Tainan Airport. It was the base of the CIA's proprietary airline operations, Tainan Airport. This was a revelation for me. I had known about the E-Systems thing, how the CIA cutout owned these facilities there at Tainan Airport, and they were also the first builder of HARP. But now to understand that the CIA was running opium, guns, and personnel in and out of Tainan Airport, well, it's starting to make sense now, isn't it? And this is not a new thing. The Tainan area was originally colonized by the Dutch in the early 1600s as the headquarters of the Dutch East India Trading Company. which was notorious for trading, guess what? Opium. And the Chinese, the Japanese, the Spanish, and the English all later established trading and military posts on the island of Taiwan. So you can bet that there's been a ton of opium trading going on in Taiwan and in the oldest area of Taiwan, which is Tainan. Tainan was the area that the first city was established. It's known as, it used to be the capital city of the island of Formosa, and the trading of opium there has been going on for centuries. Now at this point, if you're like me, a libertarian at heart, you might be saying to yourself, okay, so they were trading opium. You know, I mean, you look back in history and you look at economic numbers that different countries in the region have put out, and opium has been just another commodity. They're like, oh, we sold this much timber, we sold this much textiles, we sold this much opium, we sold this much rice. You know, it's just another thing that was exported and imported around the world. And I actually agree with that point of view. You know, everything is just a thing. It's in how you use it. You know, guns are not necessarily bad. It's a thing. It's an item. It's technology. It's how you use it that matters. It can be used for good or bad. You know, if someone is in extreme pain temporarily, opium might be a good thing. You know, I understand that people get addicted to it and stuff. That's their choice. They have to have the willpower to not get addicted to it and stuff. I mean, there's a whole another discussion there, you know, but I think what we can all agree upon is that what the CIA did with their profits from this opium trade involving the KMT irregulars in Burma and Tainan Airport was bad. What they did with the profits from these operations was fund Operation Gladio. Operation Gladio is covered in my book. It was a joint CIA and North Atlantic Treaty Organization operation where they were staging domestic terror attacks all throughout Europe, exploding bombs, shooting people, and it was all done by the Central Intelligence Agency and NATO using these stay-behind armies. Kind of a long story, but they killed 491 innocent civilians and injured 1,181 others as a direct result of Operation Gladio. The CIA and NATO did. This was funded by these opium-running operations out of Tainan Airport. They did it in order to galvanize public opinion against the communists. At the time, there were communist factions that were rising up in different parts of Europe, and they wanted to make the communists look bad. So they staged these attacks to make it look like the communists were doing it, when they were actually staged by capitalist forces. It's also interesting to note that there's a cover story for spraying us with tens of thousands of megatons of toxic waste every year. It's called global warming. You know, this is the excuse given by geoengineers who advocate for such activities. They say, oh, well, we got to spray you because, you know, global warming is getting real bad. During Operation Gladio, the CIA and NATO said, hey, communists are really bad, so, you know, we got to shoot you and blow you up with bombs. And this all made sense somehow. Of course, the real motivations for both of these things are completely different. In the case of SRM geoengineering, or chemtrails, or the New Manhattan Project, the real motivations are outlined in my book. I have a whole chapter called Motives. None of them are saving the world from global warming, I assure you that. And also this is interesting because it is in NATO countries that the most chemtrail spraying has been observed. Now there are a couple of curious cases associated with all of this. Curious case number one is in 1970, Taiwan's Atomic Energy Council established their Nuclear Energy Research Center to work on, quote, the peaceful uses of nuclear power. Now, through my research, I have been able to determine that the term nuclear power is often used as a euphemism for weather control. I know it sounds a little strange, but if you read my book, you understand that when they're talking about nuclear power, they can be speaking about electromagnetic energy. It's a generic term. They would commonly say atomic energy or atomic power, but you can substitute the phrase atomic power for electromagnetic energy, which is the defining aspect of today's New Manhattan Project. It distinguishes today's second-generation weather modification project from the old conventional cloud seeding industry where they're just spraying things. And especially when they're using the term the peaceful uses of such. There's been many instances, it's documented in my book, about how when they're talking about peaceful uses of weather control, what they're saying is domestic uses of weather control. In other words, peacetime use of weather control. The second curious case here is in 1995, the president of Taiwan at the time, a guy by the name of Lee Teng-hui, I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Lee Teng-hui, H-U-I is the last word I'm probably mispronouncing. But in 1995, he visited America. This was unprecedented. No president of Taiwan had ever visited America. But in 1995, right about when the spraying started, the president of Taiwan visits America. I put the date when the spraying started in 1996. Some people say 1995. It was right in that area somewhere in there. But right there, right when the large-scale domestic spraying operations began, we have the president of Taiwan visiting America. Isn't that interesting? And he met with a whole bunch of government officials, including California State Treasurer Ma Fong at the time, California State Secretary of Trade and Commerce Julie Wright, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee Jesse Helms, New York Senator Alphonse D'Amato, Alaska Senator Frank Murkowski, Congressman Gary Ackerman, the mayor of Syracuse Roy Bernardi, as well as other people not in politics, but in associated groups, lobby groups and whatnot. And as I mentioned, this was all supported by what was known as the China lobby in America. Now, behind this China lobby, behind the KMT and Shanghai Shek, have been a couple of families. One is known as the Soongs, and the other is known as the Kungs. Both of these families got fabulously rich during all of this, even though they lost the war. They came out of this thing as a couple of the richest families on the planet, the Soongs and the Kungs. And President Truman was very aware of this disconnect. President Truman said, quote, "They're all thieves, every damn one of them. They stole $750 million out of the $3.8 billion that we sent to Chang. They stole it, and it's invested in real estate down in Sao Paulo and some right here in New York. And that's the money that was used and is still being used for the so-called China lobby." So, as this is a continuing investigation, I think that Taiwan, the nation itself, as well as this family of Soongs and these Kungs, are all prime suspects. See you on the next one.